Alexander Peyton leans toward his dining companion, speaking fluent Mandarin Chinese as he gestures dismissively toward the service staff. His words drip with condescension, insulting the black waitress and assuming she cannot understand their sophisticated conversation. His contemptuous laughter echoes through the Michelin-starred restaurant's VIP section, drawing uncomfortable glances from nearby tables. Fellow diners fall silent, some turning away from the display. Serafina Harris stands 3 steps away, her Dom Perignon tray steady in her hands. Her dark eyes never blink, her face remaining calm as still water. Alexander continues his mockery in Mandarin, completely unaware that she has been recording everything on her smartwatch since the moment his voice turned ugly. She takes a slow, deliberate step forward, her lips gently parting to speak. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast warm amber light across the VIP dining room, where Manhattan's elite gathered for another evening of exclusivity. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, its autumn trees glowing like embers in the twilight. The soft clink of silver against fine china created a sophisticated symphony punctuated by hushed conversations and the occasional pop of champagne corks. Serafina Harris moved through the dining room with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp and professional. At 34, she carried herself with quiet dignity that seemed to emanate from within. Her movements were economical, precise, the result of months working these high-end shifts where every gesture mattered. The weight of her Apple Watch Ultra felt reassuring against her wrist, a gift from her younger sister, who insisted she deserved something beautiful, even during these difficult times. She paused at table 7, where Alexander Peyton held court with his business associates. The tech billionaire commanded attention effortlessly, his tailored Armani suit and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to deference. At 43, he possessed the kind of wealth that opened every door and silenced every objection. His startup had reached unicorn status within 18 months, making him the darling of Silicon Valley investors and business magazines alike. Beside him sat Theodore Wang, a distinguished Chinese businessman whose impeccable manners contrasted sharply with his host's growing casualness. Wang's company represented a $50 million partnership opportunity, the kind of deal that could cement Alexander's position among tech's true titans. The other guests, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and tech executives, listened attentively as Alexander regaled them with stories of his latest acquisition. Serafina approached their table, her trained smile never wavering. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I refresh your champagne?" Her voice carried a subtle warmth that had earned her generous tips from grateful customers who appreciated genuine service. Alexander barely glanced in her direction, instead turning to Wang and switching to Mandarin Chinese. His tone shifted, becoming casual and dismissive as he made deprecating comments about the service staff. He gestured vaguely toward Serafina while speaking, his words carrying the assumption that she couldn't possibly understand their elevated conversation. The other guests shifted uncomfortably as Alexander's voice grew more animated in Mandarin. He seemed to relish having an audience for his linguistic display, his comments growing increasingly contemptuous. Theodore Wang's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. Unwilling to embarrass his potential business partner in front of other investors, Serafina maintained her professional composure, though her fingers tightened slightly around the champagne bottle. Years of academic training had taught her to recognize linguistic power dynamics in real time, and she could feel the familiar weight of being reduced to invisible labor. She had encountered this behavior before during her graduate studies, in academic conferences, in countless professional settings where her presence was tolerated but not valued. The conversation at table 7 continued with Alexander ordering more champagne in Mandarin without bothering to make eye contact with Serafina. His associates exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge someone whose business connections could make or break their careers. The tech world was smaller than people realized, and crossing Alexander Payton was considered professional suicide. As Serafina moved between tables, she caught glimpses of other diner reactions. Some looked away quickly when they noticed her approach, embarrassed by the spectacle they had witnessed. Others whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from disgust to nervous amusement. A few pulled out their phones, though whether to distance themselves or document the scene remained unclear. Near the back wall, she noticed a well-worn copy of modern Chinese dialects that someone had left on the service station during their break. The academic text seemed oddly prophetic now, a reminder of the linguistic expertise she had temporarily set aside. Her dissertation research on power dynamics in multilingual corporate environments had prepared her for moments like this, though the theoretical framework felt different when experienced firsthand. The evening continued its familiar rhythm, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. Serafina could sense the other staff members' discomfort as word spread about the incident at Table 7. The sommelier avoided that section entirely while the busboys hurried through their tasks with downcast eyes. Even the maitre d' seemed more subdued than usual, his usual confident demeanor replaced by cautious professionalism. Through it all, Alexander remained oblivious to the ripple effects of his behavior. He continued his animated conversation in Mandarin, his voice carrying across the dining room as he regaled his guests with what he clearly considered witty observations. His laughter punctuated the evening air, sharp and self-satisfied, while Theodore Wang's responses grew increasingly monosyllabic. The tech billionaire's associates began checking their watches and phones more frequently, their body language suggesting a desire to conclude the evening. But Alexander seemed energized by his own performance, his gestures becoming more expansive as he warmed to his subject. He ordered another bottle of their most expensive vintage, his Mandarin instructions delivered with casual authority. Serafina completed her rounds of the other tables, her professional mask never slipping despite the growing tension in her chest. She had learned to compartmentalize during these months of service work, treating each shift as a temporary necessity rather than a reflection of her worth. The tips from tonight would go directly toward her mother's treatment fund, each dollar bringing them closer to the experimental therapy that insurance wouldn't cover. As closing time approached, the dining room began to empty. Other parties settled their bills and departed with quiet satisfaction, their evening unmarred by the ugliness that had emanated from Table 7. But Alexander's group showed no signs of leaving, the billionaire having found his rhythm and seemingly intent on continuing his linguistic display for as long as he had an audience. The stage was set for something that would transform an ordinary evening into something far more consequential. In the soft glow of the chandeliers, with Central Park's lights twinkling beyond the windows, the carefully maintained veneer of civility was about to crack open, revealing the true character of everyone present. The staff break room felt worlds away from the opulent dining area, its fluorescent lighting harsh against tired eyes, and its worn furniture telling stories of countless shifts. Serafina sat alone at the small table, staring at the medical bills spread before her like a paper mountain of worry. Each invoice bore the letterhead of Mount Sinai Hospital, each amount representing another piece of her mother's fight against stage 3 breast cancer, $8,000 per month. The number had burned itself into her memory, a figure that insurance deemed experimental, and therefore uncovered. Evangeline Harris had raised her daughter to believe in education, in dignity, in the power of knowledge to transform lives. Now that same daughter found herself serving champagne to men who spoke about her as if she were invisible, all for the chance to keep hope alive in room 412 of the oncology ward. The Columbia University acceptance letter still hung on her refrigerator at home, a reminder of the doctorate program she had abandoned mid-semester. Linguistic power dynamics in corporate settings. Her dissertation topic had seemed purely academic then, a fascinating exploration of how language reinforced social hierarchies. She had never imagined becoming a case study in her own research, watching theory become lived experience in the most personal way possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maya. "How's Mom today?" Serafina typed back, carefully omitting the details about the new symptoms, the increased pain medication, the way their mother's voice had grown thinner during their morning call. Maya was only 26, finishing her master's degree in social work, and already carried enough guilt about being unable to contribute financially to their mother's care. The break room door opened, and Marcus, one of the senior waiters, peeked in. "Rough night out there?" he said, his expression sympathetic. Word traveled fast among the staff, and everyone had heard about the incident at Table 7. "You okay?" Serafina nodded, folding the bills and sliding them into her purse. "Just need 6 more months." She whispered more to herself than to him. 6 months to accumulate enough savings for the experimental treatment protocol. 6 months to prove that dignity wasn't dependent on circumstances, that education and grace could coexist with necessity. She thought about her mother's words from their last conversation. "Baby, I didn't raise you to bow your head to anyone. But sometimes we bend so we don't break." Evangeline Harris had cleaned offices for 30 years. To put her daughter through undergraduate school, never complaining about the late nights or the aching back, or the way some people looked through her as if she didn't exist. The parallel wasn't lost on Serafina. Her mother had endured indignity with grace, transforming sacrifice into opportunity for the next generation. Now it was Serafina's turn to bear the weight, to find strength in temporary humiliation for the sake of something larger than pride. The difference was that Serafina possessed weapons. Her mother never had. 6 languages mastered through years of academic study, legal knowledge gained through research, and the confidence that came from knowing exactly what these men thought they were hiding behind their linguistic choices. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her academic contacts, professors who had encouraged her research and colleagues who understood the complexity of power structures in professional environments. Dr. Jennifer Martinez had left 3 voicemails offering to help find emergency funding. But Serafina knew the bureaucracy of academic grants moved too slowly for their current crisis. The experimental treatment had a narrow window of effectiveness, and each passing day reduced its potential impact. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was fluent in Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, Korean, Spanish, and French, a linguistic arsenal that most of these wealthy diners would never possess. Yet here she stood in a service uniform, dismissed as intellectually inferior by men who could barely order coffee in a second language. Her graduate studies had revealed how often multilingual individuals faced discrimination based on assumptions about their education and background. A memory surfaced from her undergraduate years at Howard University, where she had first encountered Dr. James Baldwin's writings on dignity in the face of systemic oppression. "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced," he had written. She had been young then, idealistic, believing that education alone could shield her from the kind of treatment she witnessed others endure. Now she understood that dignity wasn't about avoiding difficult circumstances. It was about maintaining your sense of self within them. Every shift at Le Bernardin was a choice, a strategic decision to prioritize her mother's health over her own immediate comfort. The PhD program would wait. Her research would resume. But her mother's life hung in the balance of these next few months. The kitchen timer chimed, signaling the end of her break. Serafina stood, smoothing her uniform and checking her reflection in the small mirror beside the door. Her Apple Watch showed several missed calls from her mother's care team, which she would return later. For now, she needed to return to the dining room, to table 7, to men who had no idea they were speaking dismissively about someone who could parse their conversations with academic precision. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and felt the small recording device she had discreetly activated on her smartwatch. The conversation at table 7 had been automatically transcribed and backed up to her cloud storage, a habit she had developed during her research on workplace discrimination. Documentation had always been her specialty, the careful collection of evidence that transformed isolated incidents into patterns of behavior. As she walked back toward the dining room, Serafina felt a familiar calm descend over her. This was temporary. This was strategic. This was her choice, made with full awareness of her options and their consequences. The men at table 7 saw only what they expected to see. A service worker whose presence required no consideration, whose intelligence posed no threat to their comfortable assumptions. They had no idea they were about to encounter someone who had spent years studying exactly the kind of behavior they were displaying. Someone who understood power dynamics from both theoretical and experiential perspectives. Someone who had chosen this position not from lack of options, but from an abundance of love for the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her those options in the first place. The dining room lights seemed softer as she returned to work, the atmosphere less oppressive now that she had reminded herself why she was here. Table 7 continued their animated conversation in Mandarin, their voices carrying the confidence of men who believed themselves unobserved and understood. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption could be. The amber glow of the dining room had grown more intimate as the evening progressed, muted tables now empty save for the lingering warmth of satisfied conversations and the soft residue of expensive wine. But table 7 pulsed with a different energy entirely, one that seemed to feed on its own momentum. Alexander Peyton's voice had grown louder, more animated, his gestures sweeping across the space between himself and his increasingly uncomfortable guests. Serafina approached with a fresh bottle of their requested vintage, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had learned to read the subtle signs of escalation during her months in service. The way voices pitched higher with alcohol, how personal space contracted as inhibitions loosened, the particular glint that appeared in certain men's eyes when they felt their power was absolute and unobserved. As she began to pour, Alexander switched again to Mandarin, but his tone had shifted into something darker, more venomous. His words dripped with contempt as he described black people as burdens on society, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who believed himself beyond consequences. The syllables rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, each phrase designed to dehumanize while maintaining the pretense of sophisticated discourse. Theodore Wong's chopsticks paused midway to his mouth, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. The distinguished businessman had spent decades navigating international waters, reading the undercurrents of power and prejudice that flowed beneath polite society's surface. What he was witnessing now crossed every line of professional decorum he had ever known. "Perhaps we should moderate our conversation," he suggested quietly in English, his voice carefully neutral. But Alexander was riding the wave of his own perceived cleverness, emboldened by what he mistook for an appreciative audience. He leaned back in his chair, his next words in Mandarin even more explicit as he referred to Serafina as mere decoration, emphasizing that people like her needed to understand their proper place in the social hierarchy. His laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep and ugly, a sound that seemed to stain the very air around their table. The other diners in the VIP section had begun to take notice. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, heads turning with the kind of magnetic horror that draws attention to car accidents and public meltdowns. Several guests discreetly pulled out their phones, some documenting the scene, while others scrolled nervously through social media, seeking distraction from the growing discomfort. Dr. Patricia Williams, a prominent civil rights attorney dining 3 tables away, had stopped eating entirely. Her companion, a federal judge, shook his head slowly as Alexander's voice carried across the room. They exchanged meaningful glances, the kind of silent communication that passes between people who have spent careers confronting exactly this type of behavior in courtrooms and boardrooms across the country. At table 12, Maria Santos, a Latina tech executive, felt her stomach clench with familiar recognition. She had faced similar dismissive treatment throughout her career, watching as men like Alexander assumed her presence in high-level meetings was decorative rather than substantive. Her dinner partner, an Asian-American venture capitalist, was already typing notes into his phone, his expression grim with the knowledge that this kind of behavior often reflected deeper institutional problems within tech culture. Serafina continued her service with practiced professionalism, but her training in linguistic analysis allowed her to parse every nuance of Alexander's increasingly vile commentary. She recognized the particular dialect variations he was using, the regional inflections that suggested formal education in Mandarin, which made his behavior even more calculated and deliberate. This wasn't casual ignorance. It was weaponized prejudice delivered with linguistic precision. The busboy, a young man named Carlos, who had been clearing nearby tables, moved more quickly now, his eyes downcast as he navigated around table 7. The sommelier had disappeared entirely, leaving Serafina to handle the section alone. Even the kitchen staff had grown quieter, the usual dinner service chatter replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of the tension radiating from the VIP area. Evangeline Fox, the restaurant's general manager, materialized at the edge of the dining room like a guardian angel in designer clothing. Her expression remained perfectly composed, but her trained eye quickly assessed the situation's volatility. She had managed Le Bernardin's reputation for over a decade, navigating countless delicate situations involving high-profile guests whose behavior threatened the establishment's carefully cultivated atmosphere. Alexander seemed oblivious to the growing attention his performance was attracting. His business associates shifted in their chairs, checking watches and phones with increasing frequency. The venture capitalists exchanged worried glances, clearly calculating the potential damage to their own reputations from being associated with this public display of bigotry. But none of them found the courage to directly challenge their host, their silence becoming complicity in real time. Theodore Wong set down his utensils entirely, his appetite clearly lost. The $50 million partnership that had brought him to this dinner suddenly seemed far less appealing than it had 12 hours ago. His company prided itself on ethical business practices and inclusive leadership values that stood in stark opposition to the character being revealed across the table from him. The tension in the room had become almost palpable, a thick atmosphere that seemed to press against the elegant decor and refined ambiance Le Bernardin had spent decades cultivating. Other guests began requesting their checks early, their evening's enjoyment soured by the spectacle they couldn't ignore. The restaurant's carefully orchestrated symphony of service was beginning to show strain at its seams. Near the service station, Serafina's Apple Watch displayed a small notification that her voice recording app had captured another lengthy segment of conversation. The device's advanced microphone had picked up every word of Alexander's Mandarin commentary, automatically transcribing and backing up the content to her secure cloud storage. Years of academic research had taught her the importance of documentation, the way individual incidents connected into larger patterns of systemic behavior. She moved between tables with quiet efficiency, refilling water glasses and clearing plates while maintaining the invisible presence that good service required. But beneath her professional exterior, something was shifting. a calculus of cost and benefit, of dignity weighed against necessity, of the moment when silence becomes complicity in one's own dehumanization. The stage was set for confrontation. The audience assembled, the evidence collected. All that remained was for someone to find the courage to speak truth to power, to transform private indignation into public accountability. The question wasn't whether justice would arrive, but in what form and at whose hand. The dining room held its breath, waiting for the moment when carefully maintained facades would finally crack open. The moment arrived like a shift in atmospheric pressure, subtle but unmistakable to anyone attuned to the room's emotional frequency. Serafina had finished her circuit of the remaining tables, each step bringing her closer to a decision that would transform her from observer to participant in the evening's unfolding drama. The weight of her mother's medical bills pressed against her consciousness. But something deeper, something fundamental to her sense of self, had begun to override purely practical considerations. She set down her serving tray with deliberate precision, the soft clink of crystal against silver creating a tiny percussion that somehow managed to cut through the ambient noise of the dining room. Several nearby diners turned their attention toward her, as if sensing that the evening's carefully maintained equilibrium was about to shift in ways none of them could predict. With measured steps, Serafina approached table 7, where Alexander continued his animated discourse in Mandarin, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who believed himself performing for an appreciative audience. His gestures had grown more expansive, his commentary more elaborate, each phrase designed to demonstrate his linguistic sophistication, while simultaneously degrading the humanity of those he deemed beneath his consideration. "Mr. Peyton," Serafina said, her voice cutting through his monologue with the clarity of perfectly pitched glass. The words emerged in flawless Mandarin Chinese, each syllable pronounced with the precision that came from years of academic study and native-level fluency. "Your comments are both unprofessional and inappropriate." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Alexander's mouth dropped open mid-sentence, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips as his brain struggled to process what his ears had just registered. The color drained from his face as if someone had literally pulled a plug, leaving behind the pale, shocked expression of a man whose fundamental assumptions about the world had just been shattered in public. The dining room fell into complete silence. Not the comfortable quiet of satisfied diners, but the profound hush that follows unexpected thunder. Conversation ceased mid-word, forks paused mid-bite, and even the soft background music seemed to fade into irrelevance. Every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when the invisible became visible and the powerless revealed hidden strength. Theodore Wang's chopsticks clattered against his plate, his own shock evident despite his decades of experience navigating complex international negotiations. The other business associates around the table seemed frozen in tableau, their expressions ranging from amazement to growing horror as they realized the implications of what they had just witnessed. Serafina continued in Mandarin, her tone remaining perfectly controlled and professional as she delivered each word with surgical precision. "I hold a doctorate in linguistics from Columbia University, specializing in linguistic power dynamics within corporate environments. Perhaps you're unfamiliar with the academic research on how language reinforces social hierarchies." Her pronunciation was not merely fluent. It was educated, sophisticated, carrying the subtle markers of formal training that distinguished academic Mandarin from conversational usage. Every tonal inflection was perfect, every grammatical structure precise, demonstrating a mastery that rivaled native speakers with advanced degrees. The other diners in the VIP section had begun to lean forward in their chairs, their attention completely captured by the unfolding confrontation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the civil rights attorney, had her phone discreetly positioned to record, her legal instincts recognizing the historical significance of what was transpiring. The tech executives at Table 12 exchanged amazed glances, their own multilingual abilities allowing them to appreciate the linguistic virtuosity they were witnessing. Alexander finally found his voice, but it emerged as little more than a strangled whisper. How did you? His usual articulate confidence had completely abandoned him, leaving behind only fragmented attempts at coherence as his brain struggled to reconcile his preconceptions with the reality standing before him. "Did you think speaking Chinese would hide your ignorance?" Serafina asked, switching back to English for this crucial moment, ensuring that every person in the dining room could understand her question perfectly. The words landed with the force of perfectly aimed arrows, each syllable designed to expose the fundamental flaw in his worldview. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across minutes, though it lasted only seconds. In that suspended moment, everyone present became acutely aware of their role as witnesses to something that would be discussed and analyzed for months to come. The carefully maintained facade of civilized society had been stripped away, revealing the ugly prejudices that festered beneath polite conversation and expensive clothing. Maria Santos, the Latina tech executive, felt tears of recognition and pride gathering in her eyes. She had spent countless hours in boardrooms, where men assumed her silence indicated ignorance rather than strategic patience. Watching Serafina dismantle those assumptions with such grace and precision felt like witnessing a masterclass in dignified resistance. The venture capitalists around Alexander's table began to comprehend the full scope of their predicament. They had just been exposed as complicit in behavior that violated every diversity and inclusion principle their companies claimed to embrace. Their silence during Alexander's commentary would be impossible to explain away. Their association with his bigotry, now documented by multiple witnesses and recording devices. Evangeline Fox, the general manager, maintained her professional composure, but allowed herself the smallest smile of satisfaction. In 20 years of hospitality management, she had never witnessed such a perfectly executed response to customer misconduct. Serafina had managed to defend herself while maintaining absolute professionalism, transforming what could have been an ugly confrontation into something approaching artistry. Theodore Wang slowly set down his napkin, his business instincts already calculating the impossible mathematics of maintaining a partnership with someone whose character had just been so thoroughly exposed. The $50 million deal that had brought him to this dinner was evaporating in real time, destroyed not by market forces or competitive pressures, but by the revelation of values fundamentally incompatible with his company's ethical standards. The ambient sounds of the restaurant began to return gradually, the soft clink of glassware, the whisper of fabric against chairs, the distant murmur of kitchen activity. But the energy in the room had permanently shifted, transformed by the collision between assumed power and actual intelligence, between perceived superiority and demonstrated excellence. Alexander sat motionless, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and growing anger as the full implications of his exposure began to register. His linguistic weapon had been not merely neutralized but turned against him with devastating effectiveness, wielded by someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. The moment hung in the air like a perfectly struck note, its resonance spreading outward through the dining room and beyond, carrying with it the promise of consequences yet to unfold. The silence that followed Serafina's revelation stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with potential energy that seemed ready to snap at any moment. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with every guest serving as both jury and witness to an unprecedented display of intellectual justice. The soft lighting that had seemed so elegant moments before now felt like stage illumination, spotlighting a drama that would reshape everyone's understanding of the evening's events. Serafina raised her left wrist slightly, drawing attention to the sleek device that had been recording everything. "My Apple Watch has been documenting this entire conversation," she announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what legal ground she stood upon. "Every word you spoke in Mandarin has been transcribed and automatically backed up to secure cloud storage with timestamp verification." The blood seemed to drain entirely from Alexander's face as the implications registered. His eyes darted frantically between the smartwatch and Serafina's composed expression, his mind racing through the potential ramifications of having his private bigotry preserved in digital amber. The technology he had built his fortune upon was now being used to document his own moral bankruptcy. Theodore Wang cleared his throat deliberately, his voice cutting through the tension with diplomatic precision. "I can confirm that Mr. Payton made extremely inappropriate comments about black individuals in Mandarin Chinese," he stated, his English carefully enunciated for maximum clarity. His language was not only offensive but completely unacceptable in any professional or social context. The confession hit the table like a physical blow. Wang's confirmation carried the weight of international business credibility. This wasn't some disgruntled employee making accusations, but a respected multinational executive willing to testify about what he had witnessed. His words effectively ended any possibility that Alexander could dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Dr. Patricia Williams rose from her table across the room, her movements deliberate and authoritative. "I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights law," she announced, her voice projecting clearly across the dining space. "I've been recording this interaction as well, and I'm prepared to provide testimony regarding what I've witnessed tonight." Her phone remained steady in her hand, its screen showing an active recording that had captured the entire confrontation. Maria Santos, the tech executive, stood next, her own device visible. "I represent diverse voices in the technology sector," she declared, her accent carrying the strength of someone who had fought similar battles throughout her career. "This behavior reflects exactly the kind of systemic discrimination we work every day to eliminate from our industry." Her words carried the weight of institutional change, suggesting consequences that would extend far beyond this single evening. The venture capitalists at Alexander's table began to comprehend the full scope of their predicament. Their association with this incident would be impossible to explain away to their limited partners, many of whom prioritized environmental, social, and governance principles in their investment decisions. The reputational damage would cascade through their professional networks like a toxic spillover, contaminating relationships built over decades. Alexander finally found his voice, though it emerged strained and desperate. "This is harassment," he sputtered, his usual eloquence replaced by the flailing of someone drowning in consequences. "I'll have my legal team contact your employer about this inappropriate behavior." His threat carried the hollow ring of someone grasping for power that was already slipping through his fingers. Serafina's response came with the precision of someone who had spent years studying exactly this type of legal intimidation. "Under New York State human rights law, I have the right to document workplace discrimination," she replied, her tone remaining perfectly professional. "Your comments constitute harassment based on race, which violates both state and federal anti-discrimination statutes." Her legal knowledge wasn't theoretical. She had researched these exact protections during her academic work, understanding how power imbalances were maintained through intimidation and legal threats. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that Alexander, who had assumed intellectual superiority, was being outmaneuvered by someone whose expertise far exceeded his own. "Your legal team needs to brush up on employment discrimination law," Serafina continued, her words delivered in Mandarin with perfect pronunciation, ensuring that Theodore Wang and any other Mandarin speakers in the room could appreciate the linguistic precision of her response. The phrase hit Alexander like a perfectly aimed dart, combining legal knowledge with the very language he had used to demean her. The other diners had become an audience to what felt like a masterclass in dignified resistance. Every person present understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed and analyzed for months to come. Not just the confrontation itself, but the way Serafina had navigated it with such intellectual and emotional intelligence. Evangeline Fox approached the table with the measured authority of someone who had managed countless delicate situations. "Mr. Peyton," she said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional power, "Le Bernardin has a zero-tolerance policy regarding harassment of our staff members. We'll need to discuss the evening's events and their implications for your future relationship with our establishment." The general manager's words carried subtle but unmistakable meaning. In the world of high-end hospitality, being blacklisted from establishments like Le Bernardin wasn't merely inconvenient. It was a social death sentence that would ripple through elite circles throughout Manhattan and beyond. Additional witnesses had materialized seemingly from nowhere. A federal judge dining near the windows nodded gravely as he spoke quietly into his phone, his conversation clearly involving colleagues who needed to be informed about the evening's events. Two prominent journalists whose presence at such establishments was never coincidental typed rapidly on their devices, their professional instincts recognizing a story that would resonate far beyond New York's dining scene. The technology that had enabled Alexander's fortune was now documenting his downfall. Multiple phones captured every angle of his humiliation, creating a digital record that would prove impossible to suppress or spin. The same social media platforms that had celebrated his business success would soon carry a very different narrative about his character. Theodore Wang gathered his belongings with the quiet dignity of someone who had reached an irrevocable decision. "Our business relationship ends here," he announced, his words carrying the weight of $50 million in canceled opportunities. "My company cannot associate with individuals who demonstrate such fundamental disrespect for human dignity." Then the cascade of consequences had begun. Each witness adding weight to a growing avalanche of accountability that would reshape not just Alexander's evening, but his entire future. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the documentation irrefutable. Justice, it seemed, had found its voice in the most unexpected place, delivered by someone who had been dismissed as powerless, but revealed herself as anything but. The digital avalanche began within minutes of the first witness posting their recording. Dr. Patricia Williams, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who understood the mechanics of viral justice, uploaded the video to her professional Twitter account with a caption that would prove prophetic. When assumptions about intelligence meet actual expertise, this is what accountability looks like in real time. The recording spread through social media platforms with the unstoppable momentum of authentic outrage meeting documented evidence. Within the first hour, the hashtag #TechBillionaireShamed had begun trending, amplified by activists, academics, and ordinary people who recognized something profound in Serafina's dignified dismantling of Alexander's bigotry. The video's view count climbed exponentially, 100,000, then 500,000, approaching 1 million as news outlets began picking up the story. In his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Alexander stared at his phone screen with growing horror as notifications flooded his devices. His Twitter mentions had become an endless stream of condemnation. His Instagram comment section a battlefield of justified anger and calls for accountability. The technology platforms that had helped build his fortune were now broadcasting his moral bankruptcy to millions of viewers worldwide. The first corporate domino fell at exactly 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Jin Enterprises, Theodore Wang's multinational conglomerate, issued a terse statement through their communications department. Following tonight's documented incident at Le Bernardin restaurant, Jin Enterprises is immediately terminating all negotiations and potential partnerships with Peyton Technologies. Our company maintains zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior in any form. The $50 million deal that had brought Wang to dinner evaporated in a single paragraph, but the financial implications extended far beyond that immediate loss. Other potential partners began reassessing their relationships with Peyton Technologies, their risk management teams calculating the reputational costs of association with someone whose character had been so publicly exposed. By midnight, 3 major news networks had picked up the story. CNN's breaking news chyron read, "Tech CEO caught making racist comments in Mandarin, confronted by multilingual PhD server." The segment included expert commentary from Dr. Angela Davis on systemic racism in corporate America and analysis from linguistics professors about the weaponization of language to perpetuate discrimination. CNBC's coverage focused on the business implications, with financial analysts discussing the potential market impact on Peyton Technologies' valuation. Their overnight futures trading showed an immediate 10% decline in the company's pre-market value as investors began pricing in reputational risk. The headline, "When discrimination goes viral, the business cost of bigotry," would be quoted in business schools for years to come. NPR's segment approached the story from an academic perspective, interviewing Columbia University professors who confirmed Serafina's credentials and discussed the broader implications of linguistic discrimination in professional settings. The thoughtful analysis elevated the incident beyond mere viral spectacle, positioning it as a case study in how power dynamics operate through language and assumption. The restaurant industry responded with swift decisiveness. The Manhattan Restaurant Association, representing over 200 high-end establishments, issued an unprecedented statement blacklisting Alexander from member establishments. "The behavior documented tonight violates every principle of hospitality and human dignity," their press release declared. "Individuals who demonstrate such fundamental disrespect for service professionals are not welcome in our establishments." The social media response transcended typical internet outrage, evolving into something approaching digital testimony. Hundreds of service industry workers shared their own experiences with discrimination, creating a collective narrative that positioned Serafina's confrontation as representative of countless unrecorded incidents. The hashtag #BongChos Service Workers Deserve Dignity began trending alongside the original, creating a broader conversation about respect and human worth. Asian American advocacy groups seized upon the incident as an example of how language could be weaponized to exclude and demean. The Asia Pacific Fund issued a statement praising Serafina's response while condemning Alexander's assumption that speaking Mandarin would shield his bigotry from consequences. Their analysis noted how his behavior perpetuated harmful stereotypes about both Asian linguistic superiority and African American intellectual capacity. Peyton Technologies' board of directors convened an emergency virtual meeting at 2 a.m. Their discussion focused not on damage control, but on damage assessment. The company's stock price had begun declining in after-hours trading, and their largest institutional investors were already requesting explanations. The board members themselves, wealthy executives with reputations to protect, understood that their association with Alexander had become a liability that threatened their own professional standing. The venture capital firms that had invested in Peyton Technologies faced their own reckoning. Limited partners began calling for explanations, demanding to understand how due diligence processes had failed to identify such fundamental character flaws in a portfolio company CEO. Several pension funds and endowments with explicit environmental, social, and governance mandates initiated reviews of their investments in funds associated with Alexander's company. By morning, the story had crossed international boundaries. The BBC covered it as an example of American corporate culture's ongoing struggles with diversity and inclusion. European business publications analyzed it as a cautionary tale about the global reach of social media accountability. Asian news outlets focused on the linguistic elements, with Mandarin language broadcasts praising Serafina's flawless pronunciation while condemning Alexander's cultural insensitivity. The legal implications began materializing as quickly as the social ones. Employment attorneys across the country recognized the incident as a textbook case of workplace harassment, with several firms already reaching out to Serafina through intermediaries. The documented evidence was so clear, the witnesses so credible, that potential litigation seemed less like possibility than inevitability. Restaurant reviews on every major platform began mentioning the incident, with Le Bernardin receiving praise for their staff's professionalism and implicit criticism for allowing such behavior to occur on their premises. The establishment's management found themselves in the paradoxical position of benefiting from association with Serafina's dignity while suffering from connection to Alexander's disgrace. Labor organizing groups seized upon the story as evidence of why service workers needed stronger protections and greater respect. Union representatives noted how Serafina's individual courage had achieved what collective bargaining sometimes struggled to accomplish: immediate accountability for discriminatory behavior and bitmap public recognition of service workers' intelligence and dignity. The cascade of consequences had achieved an unstoppable momentum, each revelation and response feeding into the next until Alexander's world began reshaping itself around a new reality where his assumptions about power and privilege no longer held true. The evening that had begun with casual cruelty had transformed into a masterclass in how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. The reckoning was no longer private or personal. It had become a public accounting that would reshape not just one man's future, but the broader conversation about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of intelligence in modern society. The morning light filtering through Mount Sinai Hospital's oncology ward windows carried a different quality than it had just 48 hours earlier. Serafina sat beside her mother's bed, holding Evangeline's hand as they watched the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and possibility. The overnight transformation of their circumstances still felt surreal, like emerging from a long tunnel into unexpected daylight. "Baby girl," Evangeline whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I raised you to stand tall, but I never imagined you'd stand this tall for the whole world to see." Her eyes sparkled with the kind of pride that transcended immediate circumstances, reflecting a mother's recognition that her daughter had become exactly the woman she had always believed her to be. The phone calls had begun early that morning, each conversation bringing news that seemed to rewrite the narrative of their lives. Le Bernardin's general manager, Evangeline Fox, had been the first to reach out, her voice carrying genuine warmth and institutional authority. "Ms. Harris," she had said, "we would be honored if you would consider returning to Le Bernardin, not as service staff, but as our new Director of Staff Development and Cultural Sensitivity. Your expertise in linguistics and demonstrated grace under pressure make you uniquely qualified to help us create the inclusive environment our industry desperately needs." The position came with a salary that tripled her server wages, comprehensive benefits that would cover her mother's treatments, and the kind of professional respect she had temporarily set aside, but never forgotten she deserved. More importantly, it offered the opportunity to transform her painful experience into systemic change, ensuring that future service workers would be protected by policies informed by lived experience and academic expertise. Columbia University's call had followed shortly after, delivered by Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the linguistics department chair who had been trying to reach Serafina for months. "The university is prepared to offer you a full doctoral fellowship with living stipend," she had explained, her voice filled with the excitement of someone who recognized exceptional talent. Your dissertation research on linguistic power dynamics has suddenly become the most relevant topic in academia. We want you to finish your degree while working with our new Institute for Workplace Justice. The fellowship meant she could complete her PhD while earning enough to support her mother's care and their basic needs. But more than financial security, it represented the restoration of her academic identity, the reconnection with the intellectual work that had always been her true calling. The months of enforced separation from her research would inform rather than interrupt her scholarly trajectory. The most overwhelming surprise had come from an unexpected source: the viral fundraising campaign that seemed to have materialized spontaneously across multiple platforms. Support Serafina had raised over $180,000 in less than 36 hours, with donations flowing in from around the world. Contributors ranged from fellow service workers sharing their tip money to corporate executives making substantial contributions as a form of public penance for their own industry's failings. Maya had arrived that morning, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her sister in the hospital corridor. "I've been watching the news coverage," she had sobbed, "and I keep thinking about how you never complained, never asked for help, just quietly carried everything so Mom could get better and I could finish school." The weight of family responsibility that had rested solely on Serafina's shoulders was finally being acknowledged and shared. The legal resolution had come with surprising swiftness. Alexander's attorneys, recognizing the hopelessness of their position, had proposed a settlement that included a formal public apology and a $25,000 payment for emotional distress. Serafina had accepted the terms, but donated the entire amount to the American Cancer Society's research fund, her gesture carrying more moral authority than any amount of money could purchase. "I don't need his money," she had told the lawyers, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through months of indignity. "But I need other people in my situation to know that dignity isn't negotiable and that intelligence doesn't depend on circumstances." The donation generated additional positive coverage, reinforcing the narrative of her grace and moral clarity. Dr. Patricia Williams had become an unexpected mentor, reaching out to discuss the broader implications of the incident for civil rights law. Their conversations had revealed opportunities for Serafina to contribute to legal scholarship on linguistic discrimination, transforming her personal experience into academic research that could inform future cases and policy development. The hospital room had become a receiving station for flowers, cards, and messages from around the world. Service workers from dozens of countries had written to share their own stories, creating a global conversation about dignity and respect that transcended the specific circumstances of that evening at Le Bernardin. Academic colleagues had reached out to discuss collaboration opportunities, while linguistics professors requested permission to use her case as a teaching example. Theodore Wang had sent a handwritten letter expressing his admiration for her courage and his shame at his own initial silence. "Your response taught me that true leadership means speaking truth in moments when silence feels safer," he had written. "I will carry that lesson into every business relationship for the rest of my career." His words represented more than personal growth. They suggested the possibility of systemic change within corporate culture. The experimental treatment protocol that had seemed financially impossible just days earlier was now not only affordable, but scheduled to begin the following week. Dr. Sarah Chen, the oncologist overseeing Evangeline's care, had expressed genuine optimism about the therapy's potential effectiveness, particularly given the early stage at which they could now intervene. "The timing couldn't be better," Dr. Chen had explained during their consultation. "Your mother's overall health has remained stable, and the new treatment has shown remarkable success rates in similar cases. The stress reduction from your financial security will also contribute positively to her recovery prospects." As evening approached, Serafina found herself back in the break room at Le Bernardin, but this time as a guest rather than an employee. The staff had requested a meeting to express their gratitude and to hear her thoughts on implementing the cultural sensitivity programs she would be developing. Their faces reflected a mixture of pride, hope, and recognition that their workplace would be fundamentally different because of her courage. "This isn't about revenge," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed pain into purpose. "It's about ensuring that every person who works in hospitality, regardless of their background, education, or circumstances, is treated with the dignity that all human beings deserve." The room fell silent. Everyone present understanding they were witnessing the birth of something larger than policy reform. They were seeing the emergence of a movement that would reshape their industry's relationship with equity and respect. 6 months later, the same amber light from Le Bernardin's crystal chandeliers illuminated a very different scene. The VIP dining room buzzed with anticipation as Manhattan's most influential leaders gathered for an unprecedented event: the launch of the Serafina Harris Institute for Workplace Dignity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that this celebration of service worker rights was taking place in the exact location where one woman's courage had catalyzed an industry-wide transformation. Dr. Serafina Harris, the title still felt wonderfully natural, stood at the podium, wearing academic regalia from her recent dissertation defense. Her research on digital activism and linguistic justice in the modern workplace had been unanimously approved by Columbia's faculty committee, with several professors noting that her work represented a paradigm shift in how academia approached the intersection of language, power, and social media accountability. The audience before her represented a cross-section of progress and possibility. Labor leaders sat beside tech executives who had implemented new diversity protocols. Restaurant owners who had restructured their staff training programs shared tables with academics studying workplace psychology. Theodore Wang occupied a place of honor near the front, his company having become a model for ethical business practices in international markets. "When I stood in this room 6 months ago," Serafina began, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had found her true calling. "I was serving champagne while earning my doctorate. Tonight, I'm addressing leaders while remembering that dignity has never depended on job titles, educational credentials, or social position. It depends on how we choose to treat one another when we think nobody important is watching." Her words carried the weight of lived experience transformed into institutional change. The Serafina Harris Institute had already partnered with over 50 major corporations to implement linguistic sensitivity training, helping managers recognize how unconscious bias manifested through language and assumption. The program's effectiveness was measurable. Employee satisfaction surveys showed marked improvements in workplace culture, while legal complaints related to discriminatory behavior had declined significantly across participating organizations. Maya sat at a table near the stage, her social work master's degree completed with honors and her new position as the Institute's Director of Community Outreach already yielding impressive results. The sisters had created something unprecedented, an organization that bridged academic research with grassroots activism, transforming scholarly insight into practical policy that protected vulnerable workers across multiple industries. The fundraising total from that viral moment had ultimately exceeded $400,000, enabling the Institute to launch with substantial resources and immediate credibility. But more valuable than the money was the network of supporters it had created. Service workers who had found their voices, academics who had discovered real-world applications for their research, and business leaders who had recognized that ethical behavior was not just morally necessary, but financially beneficial. Dr. Patricia Williams rose from her table to address the gathering, her presence lending legal gravitas to the evening's significance. 6 months ago, we witnessed something extraordinary in this room, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent fighting for civil rights. One woman's refusal to accept dehumanizing treatment became a catalyst for systemic change that has already improved working conditions for thousands of people across this country. The legal implications of that evening had indeed rippled far beyond the initial incident. Employment law firms were now routinely citing the Le Bernardin standard in discrimination cases, referring to the documentation and witness testimony that had made Serafina's case so compelling. Several states had introduced legislation strengthening protections for service workers, with New York leading the way through comprehensive reforms to harassment reporting procedures. Evangeline Harris watched from her wheelchair near the front row, her oncologist having declared her cancer officially in remission just 2 weeks earlier. The experimental treatment had exceeded all expectations, but Dr. Chen had noted that reduced stress and improved financial security had likely contributed to the therapy's remarkable success. The medical bills that had once seemed insurmountable were now covered by Serafina's comprehensive academic health insurance, transforming their family's relationship with hope and possibility. "My daughter taught me something that night," Evangeline said when invited to speak, her voice strong and clear. "I thought I had raised her to endure injustice with grace, but she showed me that sometimes grace means refusing to endure injustice at all. Sometimes dignity requires disruption, and love demands that we speak truth even when, especially when, it's uncomfortable for people to hear." The business community's response had evolved beyond mere damage control into genuine transformation. Restaurant associations had implemented mandatory bias training. Tech companies had restructured their diversity initiatives, and venture capital firms had begun requiring ethical assessments as part of their due diligence processes. The incident had become a case study in business schools, demonstrating how individual moral failures could cascade into institutional change when documented and shared effectively. Alexander Payton's absence from the evening was notable but not discussed. His company had ultimately survived, though significantly diminished, after he stepped down as CEO and completed a year-long program in diversity education and anger management. His public apology, delivered at a press conference 3 months earlier, had been widely considered genuine, if belated. "Some people deserve second chances," Serafina had noted in interviews. "But first chances at basic human decency shouldn't require viral humiliation to materialize." The evening's final speaker was Maria Santos, the tech executive who had witnessed the original confrontation. Her company had since become a leader in inclusive hiring practices, with their Assumption Disruption training program being adopted by competitors across Silicon Valley. "That night, I realized I had been complicit in countless smaller moments of discrimination through my silence," she admitted, her honesty lending power to her words. Serafina didn't just defend herself. She defended all of us who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated based on appearances rather than abilities. As the evening wound down, Serafina found herself standing once again near Table 7, now occupied by scholarship recipients from the Institute's educational program, first-generation college students studying linguistics, hospitality management, and labor relations. The space that had once witnessed cruelty now hosted conversations about justice, dignity, and the transformative power of education. "This table represents possibility," she told the young scholars, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that setbacks could become setups for breakthrough. "6 months ago, I was serving champagne here, while wondering if I'd ever finish my dissertation. Tonight, you're sitting here because someone believed that intelligence and worth aren't determined by circumstances, but by character and courage." The cycle was complete, but the circle continued expanding. Every person in that room carried the responsibility of creating environments where dignity flourished, where assumptions were challenged, and where courage was rewarded rather than penalized. The story that had begun with casual cruelty had evolved into something far more powerful, a testament to the truth that individual integrity, amplified by collective support, could reshape entire systems. Outside the windows, New York City sparkled with its eternal promise of reinvention and second chances. Inside, a movement had been born that would ensure those opportunities extended to everyone, regardless of who they appeared to be or what job they happened to be doing when their moment of truth arrived.